How do you solve a quadratic equation by factoring? What are the big ideas that you need to keep in mind? First of all, always start by making sure that your equation is in standard form. And here is an example of standard form. So basically, you have your x squared term first, then your x term, then your constant, and that is equal to 0. So a, b, and c are any real numbers, and a cannot be 0. So you always have to have an x squared term in there, and it can't be any higher than x squared. Another idea to keep in mind is that many trinomials, such as the one that you've got in front of you here, can be factored into the product of two binomials, and some cannot. So this method only works when your quadratic can actually be factored. But when it can be factored, and this is a really quick and easy way to solve quadratics. If your factoring skills you feel are a little rusty, now would be a great time to go review those. We also use something called the zero product principle, and that's what lets you use your factors to solve the problem. So let's put it all together and see how it all works. I've got a few examples for you. The first step, make sure we're in standard form, and yep, our equation is already in standard form. Now we start our factoring process, always looking for a greatest common factor first, because that always makes it easier, but there's no greatest common factor we can take out. Now let's factor, and you might want to hit pause and see if you can factor it on your own and then come back. So here's the factoring, and again, use whatever technique that you want to factor. Now comes our zero product principle. What that says in a nutshell is that if you're multiplying stuff together and your answer is 0, then one of the things that you multiplied must have been 0. It's really something that you've known for a long time, ever since you first started doing arithmetic. But now we have a name for it, call it the zero product principle. So what that means in this situation, we've got our two factors, 2x plus 5 and x minus 4. Those are both factors. So one of them, at least one of them, has got to be 0. So this creates two little equations for us to solve. So either 2x plus 5 has got to equal 0, and we solve that through like we normally do. Or x minus 4 needs to be 0, and we solve that. And that's our solution set. But don't take my word for it. You always, always, always should check your answers. Let's look at another equation. First step, put the equation into standard form. It's not, so we're going to have to do a little work. Again, pause if you want to do this and come back and look at the answer. So hopefully your answer looks something like this. Now we want to factor out a greatest common factor, and there isn't one, but notice that there's a -1 as a leading coefficient, and that makes things much harder to factor. So I just like to factor out that -1. Now go ahead and factor the x squared minus 14x plus 48. Again, pause and come back. In fact, pause and see if you can work the whole thing through from here, and then come back and check it out. So here's the factoring, and now we put our zero product principle into play. Now we know one of the factors is -1, and that obviously is not going to equal 0, so that one's a little bit silly. The other one, x minus 6, could equal 0, or x minus 8 could equal 0. So that leaves us with two solutions, 6 and 8, and I'm hoping that you're going to go back and you're going to check those answers just to verify. Let's look at another. Now if you'll notice, we actually don't have a quadratic here. We have a cubic because our highest power is a power of 3. However, it turns out we can still use the same method to solve this. So let's put it in standard form. All the exponents are lined up, biggest to smallest. There's a 0 on one side, everything else is on the other, so that's what means that it's in standard form. Let's factor out a greatest common factor. That would be a 2x. Now let's factor that 4x squared minus x minus 5, and you can go ahead and pause and do that work. So here's how the factoring works out. Now put the zero product principle into play. We have three factors, the 2x, the 4x minus 5, and the x plus 1. So we got to solve all three of those equations. In the first case, x could be 0. In the second equation, x is 5/4. In the last one, x is a -1. So we actually have three solutions. And that's okay because it's a cubic, and cubics can have three solutions. And now you really should check those answers. All right, let's look at one last example. Now this one looks really grungy, but it's really just a matter of getting it into standard form, which means we're going to have to do some distribution. So on the left, we're going to be multiplying that 4x by the x squared minus 2x. On the right, we've got that 2x times the 2x minus 3. So go ahead and see if you can do that distribution and combine your like terms and get everything into standard form. And whoops, I hit the button too fast, so there's your answer. But hopefully you're doing that work along with me so you can make sure that you're on the right track. Now we're going to factor out a greatest common factor. And again, if you can see how to go from here, I urge you to hit pause and go ahead and work it through and then play again. So we're factoring out an x, and then we're factoring the 4x squared minus 12x plus 9, which leads us to two identical factors. So 2x minus 3, that's just going to get us to one solution. So we're just looking at x is equal to 0 or 2x minus 3 is equal to 0, which means then we only have the two solutions, 0 and 3/2, and check your answers. All right, one last thing as a wrap-up. What we've just looked at is how to solve quadratic equations using the factoring method, and that uses the zero product principle. And you want to use that when you can easily factor a quadratic. And it really pays to get good at factoring because this is a very simple method to use and it's not error prone at all. So beef up your factoring skills and go get some practice.